Daniele Procida, Quando eravamo giovani innamorati.
Grazie, buongiorno. Mi scusate se faccio il discorso in inglese, perché è stato preparato in inglese, ma abbiamo i titoli anche in italiano. Io sono Daniele Procida, Community and Documentation Manager a Divio. Ah, no, sto parlando in italiano. Community and Documentation Manager a Divio. Ma qui siamo tutti italiani? No, ok, allora in inglese. Okay. I'm the Community and Documentation Manager at Divio, a Swiss Swiss software company. I'm a board member of the Django Software Foundation, a core developer of the Django project. I'm also a developer of Django CMS, which is one of the bigger open source Django projects. And if you can read that, you're always welcome to contact me. So, I've been using Django CMS for longer than I have been a programmer. In fact, I became a programmer in order to achieve what I wanted to do with Django CMS. I am 7 years older now, and so is Django CMS. And now I work for the company behind Django CMS. I'm a core developer of Django CMS itself. I'm the chair of its technical board. And now Django CMS is mature, respectable, and polished, just like me. So let's have a look at where we are right now. Django CMS, that is. Well, first of all, Django CMS is pretty serious. It's a big development project. We have 4,000 plus stars on GitHub, 1,500 forks, 250 commits a month, 840,000 downloads and counting on PyPy, nearly 350 contributors. And these numbers are all quite impressive, but I think the most important thing is this one, which is not listed on GitHub, that Django CMS has several dedicated paid developers that work on it. We'll come back to that point. Django CMS is now used by companies and organizations all around the world, universities, media organizations, banks, scientific organizations, arts organizations, and other corporations. We've even had a book written about us, so we really have arrived. As I said, we are mature, respectable, and polished. Now, maybe you've been involved in a project that's had a similar journey, and you've helped something become mature in this same way. But what I want to look at is that feeling at the start when everything is new and exciting. So let's go back to the beginning, to that feeling of being young and in love. So this is what it looked like quite a long time ago. And in some ways, becoming involved in a new open source software project is a bit like becoming involved in a new relationship. You don't know exactly what you've discovered, and you don't know where it will go, but it's full of promise and possibility. So I will tell you a little short love story. Quite an important one for me. About Django CMS. So back at the end of 2008, I saw a website with a promise on it. I don't know if you can read it. The new Django CMS for the Django framework. Soon you will find some information about this open source project. Well, I wanted to use Django for a project, and I wanted a CMS, and here was a promise that suggested I might have exactly what I wanted. And I remember checking that website daily to find out if it would be updated one day. And it was like visiting the post box to see if a letter had come from someone. And then one day, there was a new project. And even better, it was something that I was invited to be involved in. I remember joining the email list for the Django CMS project and the first messages on it. I remember the excitement of talking on IRC with people whom I had never met before. And they had some interesting names. It wasn't much later until I discovered that these people actually had names like Patrick and Stefan and Jonas and Angelo and Benny. I knew them only as that for some years. And we would talk every day, and I was always excited to get into work and start the conversation with these people who were all in Switzerland. I was in Cardiff. And at work, at the School of Medicine of Cardiff University where I worked, I might be looking at a problem with a colleague, and we would say, let's ask Patrick. So we jump onto IRC and we talk to Patrick. And then Patrick, or it might be Stefan, or it might be one of the others, would say sometimes, well, sometimes they would say, no, we can't do that. And sometimes they would say, that's not a bad idea. And sometimes they would say, let me go outside and have a cigarette and think about it. And for us, in our little office in Cardiff, that was the most exciting thing, that we had the power to have an idea that made a professional software developer in Switzerland have to go outside and smoke a cigarette in order to answer our idea. So that was tremendously exciting to have that kind of effect on other people. Sometimes, and this was the greatest excitement of all, it would be a 2-cigarette problem. Patrick would say, I'm going to have 2 cigarettes for this one. And we would say, oh, Patrick thinks it's a 2-cigarette problem. And we were so proud and excited. And we didn't smoke, but that became our code for when we found a tasty problem at work. This is a 2-cigarette problem, so even though none of us smoked. So it was huge fun. And I loved many things about it. I loved some of that idealism of free software. I loved the idea of being free, that when I was doing this, I was not answering to my managers at work. I was operating in quite a different way. I loved the idea of being a volunteer, that I didn't have to do this. I could choose to. I loved the idea of that I was contributing to something, that I had some useful abilities that benefited a wider community. I loved that I was making a difference, that I was having ideas and having them accepted. I liked being valued by other people for what I was able to contribute. And I loved being an inventor, creating new things out of thin air. So, yeah, very exciting. Now, some people, the excitement of being a programmer might seem a little bit dull if that's what they like to do, yeah. But that's not my kind of excitement. So, that doesn't appeal to me at all. So maybe other people have different standards of excitement from me. Maybe my excitement about writing open source software is a bit lame or a bit nerdy, I don't know. But that's how it is. It was exciting. It really was one of the most thrilling times of my life. Just like this time was. Now, this particular excitement was a long time ago, 22 years ago, and the discovery of, the excitement of discovering Django CMS and open source software, well, that was 7 years ago. What about now? Now, the thing that everybody has to understand about excitement, especially excitement about things that are new, is that that kind of excitement doesn't last forever. In fact, that kind of excitement can't last forever. And if you expect it to, or if you get too nostalgic for it, then you fall into the same kind of trap as a middle-aged person who starts to feel disappointed that their partner of 25 years no longer makes them feel the way they used to 25 years ago. And it's not reasonable. And the next thing you know, you find yourself having feelings that you don't quite understand about somebody who turns out to be half your age, or regressing into the past and a relationship from half a lifetime ago, but generally having a midlife crisis. And if there's one thing that we know about midlife crises, is that they're funny to watch when they're in a Bill Murray film, but not so much fun when you're actually involved in one for any kind of reason. They tend to end badly for everyone. And they end badly because people had the wrong expectations about excitement and how things should feel. So that's one trap that it's quite easy to fall into as a relationship matures. Another trap that's equally destructive is to neglect important feelings altogether and to forget that they matter and how much they matter. So if we forget to look after a relationship, it just becomes older. Whereas it must grow and develop, and we must continue to find new and exciting things in it. It's a relationship that, because it's a relationship, it has to be something that is done in the relationship, which means together. So, be mature about these things. 7 years later, I'm still heavily involved in Django CMS, in this mature project. What does the fact that it is mature mean for the relations between us and our community? Where does excitement fit into this picture now? Well, definitely we are not developing Django CMS in the way that we used to. We're a large team now. We can't do things the way we used to. It's not like it was 7 years ago when somebody would appear out of the blue on IRC with a tasty problem, and somebody would have to go outside to smoke a cigarette and then come back with an idea for implementing the solution. That's not a sustainably mature way of dealing with things. So the relationship that we have with our community also has to mature. So they were exciting times 7 years ago, but you can imagine the chaos if everybody felt the need to keep that excitement going in the same way. So we have to pass through a transition. And it's natural to feel the loss of some of that excitement. It doesn't hurt to remember it or to think about it. In fact, I think it's important to continue thinking about it. But equally important is to think about the transition and the new directions. And in every aspect of life, not just in software development, if you're in a period of transition and you don't think enough about where you're going to go or what decisions to make, you will find that circumstances make those decisions for you, and then it is too late for you to make the choices. One of the signs of being in a period of transition is that problems start to occur with things that previously worked well. So I'm the community manager for Django CMS, so part of my job is to read and understand those signs. And it's natural that we should see these signs of problems, and it's natural that we should encounter them, because every relationship faces challenges as it develops. It's not necessarily a sign of something wrong, it's a sign of something changing. It's when they are ignored that it becomes a problem. So for an open source software community, one of the ways in which these changes are expressed to us are actually through complaints from members of the community. And we hear all kinds of things directed at us or that people say to each other. I feel I can't trust Django CMS because it's developed to serve a company's needs, not the community's. Or I mentioned the IRC channel. Nobody answers me anymore on the IRC channel. Issues I raise are ignored. The community isn't what it used to be. So nobody likes hearing complaints, especially not me. But we have to understand what these complaints mean. It could mean that we have selfish, ungrateful users who don't realize how hard we work, which is quite a tempting thing to think. Or it could be a message that we as a community are failing. But I don't think either of those things are right. I think what it means is that the relationship is changing, but the expectations have not. And this is something, again, that happens everywhere, that expectations change more slowly than relationships do. So relationships will change, but the expectations will fall some way behind. The other half of this relationship I'm talking about is our open source community. What kind of relationships do we want to have with the community? What kind of relationship should we offer? What kind of relationship should the community expect? And this is not just a problem for Django CMS. It's a question that's confronting many open source projects. We have the same discussions in the Django project itself all the time, because Django project is changing, our relationship with our community and user base are changing, and what people expect of us, or of it, is sometimes behind the reality of the situation. And they're genuine questions, and they don't have obvious answers. Well, there is one obvious answer, and the answer is, I think, that we need to be thinking about this now so that we're not taken by surprise later, or find ourselves in circumstances that we don't like because we failed to act. So when it comes to people and their relationships, this is part of the difference between growing and simply growing older. So to grow is to change in an appropriate way, to develop, or perhaps even to become better. And if a software project grows, develops, instead of just becoming older, if it becomes more mature, it does benefit. It will benefit from things like becoming more stable, benefiting from more consistent policies, contributors, release cycles. A mature project can enjoy more dependable backing or funding. It becomes more sustainable. It can be planned better. Maybe it becomes less exciting. Maybe it even becomes a bit boring, but there are some advantages in being a little bit boring. The alternative, well, there isn't really an alternative, not a long-term sustainable alternative. It's not sustainable to continue a project, whether we are talking about a personal relationship or the development of software, on the basis of enthusiasm or excitement alone. In either case, the project eventually falls apart and everybody suffers, unless it's a Bill Murray film, in which case you leave the cinema 90 minutes later laughing. But that's only the case for Bill Murray movies and not the case for real life. So think of all the things that need to be done to keep a relationship healthy in the long term. Things like being aware of change, being aware of the need to maintain some kind of interest, excitement, and engagement. Being able to manage transition well. Maintaining dialogue open about needs and expectations. Being prepared to try new things, which sometimes will not be successful. that's okay. Not everything can be successful. Being able to recognize problems as challenges and being able to act in advance rather than react too late. Now, these things, they're all necessary and they're all important, but they're not sufficient. And when it comes to software, there's one more thing that's really key, and it's something that people don't like talking about. And that thing is money. So I mentioned earlier that one sign of Django CMS's success as a maturing project was that it now has several dedicated paid developers working on it. So these are people who get paid to develop Django CMS, not just to write code, but also to do things like write tests and documentation, to review submissions, to examine bug reports, to test it, to meet to discuss it, to support it, to understand users' needs, and so on. And I'm one of these people. I know there's at least one other person in this room whose job, in effect, it is to be part of that team. And money, financial backing, funding, really does make a difference to a project. So another good example would be the Django project itself. In the last 18 months or so ago, the Django Software Foundation began raising money specifically for the purpose of employing a Django fellow, a contractor who worked for the Django Software Foundation to help manage some administrative tasks and community management tasks associated with the code base of Django. It's been hugely successful. We've got one developer working full-time as a Django fellow. Each week, the number of tickets that get triaged has grown and has maintained a steady pace. We have reviews and merges of about 15 non-trivial patches each week from community members and core developers. And for the first time in Django's history, we've had 2 releases in succession that arrived on schedule. And it's only one person working full-time on Django, employed by the Django Software Foundation. But it really has made a difference to Django's development. I'm going to tell you a little horror story now. So if anybody here is of a sensitive disposition, they might wish to leave the room while I tell this story, because this is not for, as I say, for sensitive people. You may well, in fact, have heard this story already. Does anybody know what happened at 61 minutes to midnight on New Year's Eve in 2011? A pull request was committed. It was a pull request to the OpenSSL project by a PhD student, which was reviewed and then committed by one of the core developers of the project. It contained the heartbeat bleed bug. This horror bug, which was described as being so bad that it makes shutting down the internet for a while seem like a good idea, compromised a library that's used by millions upon millions upon millions of systems across the world. It compromised a vast number of products and services. It affected Debian, Ubuntu, OpenBSD, FreeBSD. It affected Amazon, Google Search, it affected Android, Google Search, Gmail, YouTube, Wallet, Play, Apps, and the App Engine. It affected Amazon, Facebook, Tumblr, Yahoo, and Cisco, and more. It probably affected most of the people in this room, if not all of them. And it wasn't discovered until more than 2 years later, in April 2014. It cost the global economy an estimated hundreds of millions, if not billions, most probably billions of dollars to fix. It made many people unhappy, let's say. There was a huge amount of criticism, complaint, and abuse that was directed at OpenSSL, its developers, and at open source software in general. The anti-open source software movement, if there is such a thing, had a great day. It was evidence of the failure of open source software to manage critical projects properly. By the way, if you have 20 minutes to spare and want to read some abuse, go back in time to April 2014 and read comments on news articles about the OpenSSL bug and about the heartbleed bug, and you'll find out exactly what kind of abuse was directed at the developers. This is mild. This is from the leader of the OpenBSD project. OpenSSL is not developed by a responsible team. Well, that's a painful thing to hear. Now, why was the open source world so shocked? And one reason for it is that this failure seemed to violate a key faith of the open source movement, that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, meaning because open source software is infinitely exposed to people who can read it and check it and review it, means that no bug should be too difficult to spot or to fix. That's Eric S. Raymond, who's a well-known author in the open source software world. So let's put this into context. Hundreds of thousands of companies and billions of people were dependent upon OpenSSL for their internet security in one way or another, whether they used it directly or they used a product or service depended on it. OpenSSL was and is a big deal. And when something went wrong with it, it had an economic effect that went into the billions. So what about the team, the supposedly irresponsible team behind this big deal project with huge global implications? Jim Zemlin, the Linux Foundation Executive Director, not enough eyeballs. There are no eyeballs here. Two guys named Steve, and I hear they also have a very nice dog. The dog wasn't doing code review. Now, he was exaggerating a bit. In fact, I think there were 4 core developers of the project, and they weren't all called Steve. But the OpenSSL Foundation behind the project was raising apparently less than $2,000 a year. This tiny band of 4 people were responsible for maintaining what was in effect a cornerstone of the internet, and they were pretty much expected to do it for free. Hard to imagine any other industry where such a thing would be possible. And this is only one example, and it's an example we know about because something went wrong. Not entirely unsurprisingly, given the complexity of the code and the fact that the core developers were 4, the fact that they weren't being paid, and the fact that the appropriate time for reviewing and committing patches was 1 hour before midnight on New Year's Eve. This has happened before in other ways, and it will continue to happen. So this is what people imagine when we tell them about open source software, that they'll learn to code, they'll write a program, profit. But the reality is that you might create a vital cornerstone of the internet, maintain it in your free time as free open source software, and as a reward, collect abuse. That's how it works. And that, I think, is very clear evidence that there's something very immature in the attitudes within our industry and towards it, and towards open source software in particular. I'll tell you another short story, also about a problem with software. And it happened on Thursday, actually. This week, the Django CMS project received a report of a security vulnerability. I think it was trending on Twitter or something like that a couple of days ago. So Django CMS is a successful project, but it is not by any stretch of the imagination a cornerstone of the internet. It powers tens of thousands of sites, but not billions of systems. Django CMS is much less important, however much we love it, than OpenSSL. But within a very short time of receiving the report, we had several people working on it together at the same time, and they spent several hours looking at it in detail. We weren't doing it in our free time. We were being paid for it. It wasn't a crisis that distracted us from our jobs. It was our job. So compare this to the way the OpenSSL story unfolded. What a luxury. What a world where being paid to work can be considered a luxury. So these are these problematic, immature attitudes that apply to open source software in particular. The concept that software can be free has somehow been understood to mean that programmers can afford to work for nothing. Somehow the idea that it's great to be a volunteer has become the idea that programmers can be expected only to be volunteers. And it's an idea that's become normal, even though we know perfectly well that programmers need money to survive in the world, just like the rest of us. Because we have free software, we tend not to have free housing, free food, and so on. Yet it's an idea that both people and corporations and systems live by. I don't mean that they think those things explicitly, but the idea regulates the way they act, even if they don't think about it explicitly. In fact, I think one of the problems is that they do not think about it explicitly, and so it's easy to fall into patterns when you don't think about things explicitly. So the consequences of this idea are crises like Heartbleed, exhausted or underpaid, disillusioned developers, projects which have very bright starts and then fail and falter and crumble. In the worst case, global risk, as in the example of Heartbleed. It's a technical and also a human failure. So maybe you remember these things that I introduced at the beginning, these things that I loved so much when I started in open source software and are still important to me. Not just to me personally, I think they're still important to free open source software. They still excite me. But I can only enjoy them in the long term because they are not the things that sustain my participation. I can enjoy these things because I have a paid job. If I did not have a paid job, I would not be able to enjoy those things. Other people can enjoy these things in the Django CMS project, that is, members of our community, because the Django CMS project has commercial value, because it helps sustain a company, because it employs people like me. I can afford to be excited about these things because each month, like Swiss clockwork, my salary arrives in my bank account. And it's not, by the way, less than $2,000 a month arriving by chance to be shared by 4 people. It's something that is dedicated to me as part of my job. And it puts me in a position to do those things. What we cannot realistically do is expect all or even most of our involvement to be based on those things. We can't expect the experience now in a mature project to be what it was like in that project in its infancy. Now, I admit that I would love it if when I had a good idea, I could speak to a colleague who would have to go outside to smoke a cigarette and then come back after his cigarette or two with a way to implement my fantastic idea. But instead, what actually happens, we have to have meetings, estimations, deal with project managers, and then something else turns out to have a higher priority and my great idea gets abandoned. But it would be unreasonable to want things to continue that way always. It's incompatible with the development of our software and incompatible with the maturity that makes these things possible in the long run. And it's the same here. We can still enjoy some of those things that were special or magical about the early days, and they're still important and still exciting, but they're only enjoyable in the long term because they're not the only things that sustain participation in the relationship. We can enjoy them because of the boring, unexciting things that make them possible. We can enjoy them because of the unexciting value that has been invested in the relationship. And we can afford to be excited about them because they're being paid for through the daily work of maintaining a family, a household, a relationship. We can't, 22 years later, expect all or most of our lives to be like that. We can't expect the experience now to be like the experience it was then. And again, it would be quite nice. Sometimes I think, I would like it to be as it was 22 years ago. And there are obligations and commitments and other things that get in the way. And it's disappointing, but it's disappointing because it's an unreasonable expectation. It's an expectation that's incompatible with a long-term relationship that makes possible the things that I value in it. So I can't really give any useful or practical advice, either about relationships or about software. So I suggest if you want clear advice about those things, probably better talk to other people. But I think the key to success, rather than to mere survival, or maybe even also the key to survival, is to have reasonable expectations rather than false ones. So I mentioned some of the complaints we get from the open source community sometimes. And I said that they're not a sign necessarily that something's very wrong. They're a sign that reality has moved faster than expectations. But there are some ideas that I think actually are false and need to be challenged. For example, the idea that companies' money corrupts the purity of open source ideals. So we hear this about Django CMS. I've heard it about other things. I've heard it about other projects. I've heard it about proposals for conferences, that the idea that a company is behind an open source conference might in some way disturbing the idealism of that community. I think I can understand why people had that idea, but I think it's a mistake, and I think it's false. There's the idea that being a volunteer is somehow being better than being paid. But maybe it's more generous of you to be a volunteer than to be paid, but it's an option you can afford only after you have been able to pay your bills. You can't only volunteer. Another false idea is the idea that open source projects, important open source projects, will somehow naturally, through some mechanism of fate, get the support they need. Well, we know perfectly well from the example of Heartbleed and others that important projects do not necessarily get the support they need. Another false idea is that we do not need to talk about money in open source software, or that talking about money is somehow talking about a dirty subject. Well, yes, we do need to talk about money, and we need to make everybody think and talk about the monetary value of labor that goes into open source software and the monetary value the software itself represents. Don't like talking about money. You know, if you want to spoil everyone's appetite at lunch, just say, by the way, how much do you earn? And you can guarantee that will be the end of a nice conversation around your table. But open source software is not the same thing as having a friendly lunch. It's something that has global significance. And if we are too shy or too timid to talk about money in this industry with global implications, that would be, to me, a very clear sign of immaturity, of unwillingness to confront something that must be confronted in a very straightforward way. Another false idea is that everything will be all right in open source software. It most definitely will not be. I gave just one example, OpenSSL and Heartbleed, but there have been so many others, and there will continue to be, of examples of technical and human failure. Because things will not always be all right. And we need to, again, get used to talking about the ways in which these things can go wrong and ways in which they might be going wrong because of a lack of money or an unwillingness even to talk about money. So it really was wonderful to be young and in love. And it is wonderful to discover an exciting new open source software project that you can be part of. But what makes both of these things great is the promise that they hold for the future. That's why being young and in love is so exciting, is because it's a promise for the future. That is what this being involved in a new software project, what's so exciting about that is the promise that that holds for the future. Because in the future, you won't be young anymore, and your software project won't be you anymore. But the future is where you can fulfill the promise of being young, but only if we're able to grow up, to develop, as well as simply getting older. And still, right now, we're in a world where very often software projects and people's attitudes to them and their relationship with them are getting older, but they're not growing up. And that is the problem, I think, that we need to tackle with some urgency. That's it.
Benissimo, ci sono domande?
What's the main place to discuss the future of Django CMS and the roadmap?
You mean Django CMS specifically or any project in general? Django CMS, I think that for members of the community, they have to work at the relationship. In the beginning, it was very easy to make a difference because the people on the other side of the relationship, the people on the IRC channel and so on, they were also very excited that their new baby was being admired by people on the other side of the world. Oh, there's this guy in Cardiff who's using our project. A university is using Django CMS. That was 7 years ago. So it was quite easy for members of the community to have an influence. It's much more difficult now. And I think people from the community who want to become involved have to be more persistent, have to be more patient, have to go through more obstacles to make a difference. Even for me, working within the company, backing it. So you're already working on Django CMS, so you're already partly on the inside, so you have an advantage. So we have the channels, we've got email lists and GitHub and IRC. I think that, as in many relationships, one of the things to do is simply to insist on keeping open dialogue. And it is a hard thing to say and a hard thing to recognize, but it might be sometimes that the needs that Divio, for example, have of Django CMS might be different from the needs the community have. And that's a shame, but it is open source software. You can take it in directions you want. It's not that it's been corrupted by commercial interests, as though it was some pure thing that now has been steered in a direction because of money. It always was a project that had commercial value. So there is no easy answer. In some cases, I'm not sure what the answer is, but definitely part of it has to be to keep talking, if necessary, in a persistent way. I don't know if that's much of an answer.
Yeah, you already partially answered the question I had in mind, so I'm a bit rephrasing on the fly. I'm involved with Django CMS a lot, so I'm on for Django CMS project. I am on one side of the contributors. I mean, long-term contributors who have who had huge impact on the code base. But since 1 year, 1.5 years, I wanted to start contributing to Django core, and so I made a lot of effort. I'm making a lot of effort to start contributing, and so as you said, it takes determination and being patient. And the larger the project, the more determined and patient you have to be as a member of the community. But do you think that, I mean, the open source, the governance of an open source project has the burden of balancing the value of the project and its history and the needs of all the stakeholders, the existing stakeholders, and provide motivation for new contributors to come in. Do you think what are the levers, the mechanism an open source governance can use to keep the motivation high of the new contributors and provide fulfillment for new lovers? Because everyone contributing to an open source project is as different. It's a different stage of the relationship. Long-term contributors is in a very mature phase of their relationship, while newcomers are just young and just started loving the project. So it's a difficult balance. And do you think there is already some answers to these for the governance boards of the open source projects, or we still need to figure out how to do this?
I think that, first of all, you're absolutely right that the analogy between a personal relationship between two people and the relationship between a software project and its community of maybe hundreds of people breaks down in certain places. So there will always be, for example, new people entering into the community relationship. And I think it is a perpetual, not struggle, but a perpetual challenge to integrate all of these competing and different needs that people have of the relationship. So you mentioned the Django project itself. Ironically, and see, I didn't mention this before, but everything has an effect. So one of the great things to have happened in the Django project in the last 2 years was the creation of the Django Fellow. Ironically, he has been so efficient that he has mopped up many small things that actually provided ideal ways for newcomers to get into contributing to Django. So, and he's done really good, important things like implement automatic spelling checking for the documentation and linting for the Python code. And it used to be that somebody who was taking their first steps in open source software and didn't want to refactor the ORM or undertake something that could turn a person 25 years older overnight, but wanted to just make sure they understood the basic thing and correct a spelling mistake in the documentation. Well, there used to be many, many places you could do that, and it was great. And now they all get tied up so quickly by Tim Graham that it's a little bit harder for real beginners to find a way in. So, I wonder, for example, whether we should actually deliberately leave some tiny low-level, low-hanging fruit, they call it, for people to pick up. So that might be a slightly counterintuitive thing to do, to deliberately not fix things to allow for more engagement. And in answer to your other question, I think absolutely this is the responsibility of the governors of open source software governance, because they are the ones who set the whole tone and standards of participation. So they need, of course, the participation and the cooperation of the members of the community, but they have to be the ones responsible for making it possible in certain ways. And I'm not sure what those ways are, but I shouldn't say that because that's my job. I'm a community manager. It's my job to try and find out. And I think it's something that we have to keep on learning all the time. Projects change.
Sono altre domande? Other questions?
Hi. First of all, thank you for the amazing talk. And as a free software developer, I feel that the economic problem is huge at this moment. So my question is, do you think that every free software developer needs to be an entrepreneur or like working for a software company, or we can figure out a way to sustain free software development without like doing business and first person?
Yes, I think that yes, I think that all the options are open. So let's look at the Open SSL example. I don't know whether it would be better for them to be employed by a large internet company that could easily afford to pay their salaries. I don't know whether it would be better if they could somehow sell their services. I don't know if it would be better if there were a foundation that collected money every month on their behalf. I'm not sure. What I do know, the only thing that I'm really sure about is that we cannot have a situation where on New Year's Eve, at 1 hour before midnight, somebody is reviewing and committing patches because that's the time that they have available in which to do it. So I think anything is possible, and maybe we have to be more imaginative about it than we have been. And I think simply by talking about it, we will change the ideas. And the dangerous thing about, I talked about some false ideas, the dangerous thing about those false ideas is not that people believe them, but that people don't think about them, but live by them all the same. So if you have an idea that's false and you start thinking about it, there's at least a chance that you will realize it's false. If you live by a false idea without ever thinking about it, you'll never challenge the idea. You'll just continue living in this unsatisfactory, potentially dangerous pattern. So we have to bring these up, make these explicit is better than implicit, even when it comes to, especially when it comes to ideas. And then maybe we'll find a way.
Handler?
Now, thank you for the talk. You really hit some of the points which are very important for long-term sustainability, stuff nobody talks about. My question was basically what he once asked, so I'm going to change to, do you see some value, or what's your opinion if in the same way hackers have hacked open source networking, hacking business entrepreneurial training for open source developers to give them the tools so they can start learning to think about money alongside the code that they're developing?
Definitely, it could be. Yes, I mean, I think everything is on the table. Also, I think one thing that would be quite valuable would be something that makes it easier for people to learn to say no. So it's a very strange effect that somebody creates an open source software project, they give it as a gift to the world, and remember I said that the step 1, learn to code, step 2, write a program, step 3, profit, doesn't really work. Well, what happens is that they write this, and by giving it to the world, they don't collect rewards, they collect debt. They're now indebted to all the people who use it. They feel an obligation to their users. So it's as if I give you something for free that I didn't need to give you, and now I have an obligation to you to make sure that that thing keeps working. You know, here's a bicycle, beautiful bicycle. Oh, thank you very much. And forevermore, you will be at my house at 1 hour to midnight on New Year's Eve saying, oh, by the way, the brake is not working properly. That's how people fall into that, which is not unique to OpenSSL. You see it in all kinds of projects. People should be able to have a different relationship with their users. And I fall into that thing too. You know, a bug in my project, somebody's complaining, oh, I must solve this. Well, why must I solve it? I was not quite sure, but it's very easy to find yourself in that. Yeah, Jakob.
So we are talking about educating developers to properly communicate to their community, okay? But how to do you see a chance to be able to slightly change the social contract that the developers of open source and the community has in terms of exactly the developers not being in debt forever with their community, and not only with individuals, which maybe just use your project for their weekend project and that's all, but also larger companies that use your software for free and maybe ask you for features, or yeah, you have to fix this because I use this in my multi-million project.
Exactly. Yeah. Or in my nuclear power station, or my software that runs a medical apparatus or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think Heartbleed and other recent examples have been a wake-up call, as the Americans say. But the problem with alarm clocks is, especially if you, I don't know if you have teenage children, but the capacity of a 19-year-old to hear an alarm and then put the alarm to sleep again is incredible. So just having an alarm doesn't make people wake up. And the 19-year-old does it because maybe, in the case of my son, he's a bit immature. Oh, I can afford to have a few minutes more sleep. So he silences the alarm and falls asleep. The danger is that our immature industry or attitudes will do the same thing with these alarms that we're having from big crises like Heartbleed. It's a matter of education. And if we don't achieve it, we're going to see more and more of the same, but worse. And how, I'm not sure. As I say, I don't really have advice about how to do it, except saying that we must find a way to do it. So the fact that we're talking here now maybe is a start.
Thank you. Well, let's take it one step further from talking. Let's do a hackathon, right? And in the same way the Free Software Foundation was born, let's try to make the Free Software Funding Foundation of sorts and put the first brick in the ground.
Yeah, okay. So action, instead of... I did have an idea, and I decided not to talk about this because it's not really formed, but supposing that we organized a global, universal strike of open source developers for 24 hours, that every software developer promises not to work even for 1 minute on something they're not paid for. Yeah? Just to prove a point. If every programmer in the world, just for 24 hours, they still do their normal job because they're being paid, but just for that 24 hours, they don't do any work on something that they're not being paid for. Even their hobby fun things. Because even their hobby fun things create value in the world. Yeah? Nothing. What would be the effect of that? I mean, in terms of practical terms, economic terms, would it make the news? What would people talk about it? So maybe that would be... I'm not sure necessarily that I'm in a stage of my life where I want to be known as that guy who instigated a global strike of programmers, but it would be one way to get into Wikipedia, I suppose. So, yeah. So I think maybe there are practical avenues too.
Sono altre domande?
Well, yeah.
Ultima.
No, giusto per segnalare che domattina con Riccardo, Roberto e Alessandro, giusto? No, ok, guest star possibile. Parleremo esattamente di questi temi domattina, e quindi avremo un piccolo panel proprio su cosa significa essere sviluppatore di un progetto open source.
So, thank you very much for listening and for your questions and feedback. Thank you to Divio, because Divio is the company I've worked for a couple of years now, and have made a lot of things possible for me, including a lot of the things that I really enjoy about open source. Thank you to Django CMS and its community and everybody on both sides of that community, because that's been an enduring love story of my life in the last 7 years. And thank you also to the girl that I climbed into a hammock with at a party 22 years ago, because that's been another one that has also worked very well for me. So thank you very much.